My name is Serena, and I am 32 years old. The private dining room at the Fairview Club in downtown Toronto holds 83 people, and every single one of them was there the night my mother-in-law decided, in front of all of them, that I was not family. The room was the kind of place that made you adjust your posture the moment you walked through the door. Dark wood paneling, white tablecloths so pressed they looked like paper, servers in black vests who refilled your water before you noticed the glass was low. My mother-in-law had reserved the entire floor for her 70th birthday dinner. She had been planning it since March, had chosen the menu herself, had sent handwritten cards to every guest instead of an evite, which she told me was the proper way to do things. I had helped her address 30 of those envelopes at her kitchen table in November because her wrist had been aching, and she'd said thank you in the distracted way she always said thank you to me, like I was a person hired to do a tasks, rather than the woman who had been married to her son for 6 years. My husband Colin sat beside me at the round table near the window. He had his hand over mine when we first sat down, and I remember noticing how still he seemed, the way he gets before something he has already decided. I didn't think much of it then. I thought he was just nervous about the room, about his mother, about all the things that go unspoken in families like hers. I had driven myself to be hopeful that night. I know how that sounds. Deliberately manufactured optimism, like something out of a self-help book, but I had genuinely tried. My mother-in-law and I had never been warm, and I had made my peace with that years ago. She was a woman who had a very clear idea of what her family should look like, and I had not fit that picture from the first afternoon. Colin brought me to her house in Forest Hill. I was from Sudbury originally. I had paid my own way through university at Waterloo, taken out OSAP loans that I was still paying off in my late 20s. I drove a used Civic until it died, and then bought a used Corolla. None of these things were secrets, but in Rosalind's world, they were something close to a character flaw. Her other son, Gavin, had married someone whose family summered in Muskoka and wintered in Palm Springs. I knew because my mother-in-law mentioned it at every opportunity, usually in the same breath as mentioning Gavin's wife's charity work or Gavin's wife's family's connections. She was not unkind about it. That was the thing about Rosalind. She was never unkind in a way you could point to directly. She was precise and careful and elegant, and she made you feel insufficient without ever using a single rude word. But that night she did use rude words, or close enough. She waited until the main course had been cleared. The room had relaxed into that post-dinner warmth, wine glasses half full, the low hum of a dozen conversations blending together. Gavin clinked his glass for quiet and nodded to his mother, who rose from her seat with the kind of composure that looked like it had been rehearsed. And knowing Rosalind, it probably had been. She began the way these speeches always begin. She thanked the staff. She thanked the Fairview Club for accommodating her guest list. She said something gracious about 70 being just a number, which got the expected laugh. She talked about her late husband, Colin's father, who had passed 4 years earlier, and several people at nearby tables looked down at their hands. She talked about the family she had built, the values she had tried to pass on, the pride she felt watching her sons become the men they were. And then she raised her glass, and her voice shifted into something different, still composed, still elegant, but underneath it, something that had been held back for a long time. She said she wanted to acknowledge the people in the room who were truly part of her family. The people who had, as she put it, grown into us. She looked at Gavin and smiled. She looked at Gavin's wife and actually placed a hand on her own chest, like she might cry. She named 3 friends who had been in her life for decades, and called them family too. And then her eyes moved to our table, and she looked directly at me, and she said, "There are people in our lives who are still finding their place. And that's all right. Not everyone grows into a family. Some things simply don't take." The table went quiet. I don't mean the room. The room was still murmuring, but the people close enough to have heard her clearly went quiet in that way, where everyone suddenly finds something to look at that isn't your face. Colin's cousin across the table made a small movement with her mouth that she covered with her napkin. Gavin looked at his wine glass. I understood what she had said. I wanted to believe she had misspoken, had chosen a metaphor that came out badly, had not meant it the way it landed. But then she continued. She smiled at me with complete serenity and said, "Serena, why don't you give us the room? This next part is really for family." 83 people. I counted them afterward, because I needed something to do with my mind. 83 people. some of whom I had known for 6 years, some of whom I had sat next to at Christmas dinners and Canada Day barbecues, some of whom I had driven to medical appointments when their own children lived too far away to help. And she had asked me to leave. The silence that followed was different from the kind you read about in moments like this. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was just very quiet and very still, and the kind of embarrassing that doesn't feel like an attack in the moment. It feels like gravity, like something you can't argue with, like a truth that is being named in public, that you had always privately suspected. The kind of quiet where pity and relief mix together on people's faces because they are glad, in some small, shameful way, that it is not them. I put my hand flat on the tablecloth. I could feel the weave of it under my palm. I thought about the drive back to the hotel. I thought about 30 envelopes on Rosalind's kitchen table, and how careful I had been to leave the flaps clean so the seal would hold. I pushed my chair back. The leg caught on the carpet and made a sound I did not intend, and I stood up in a way that I hoped looked like a choice and not a retreat, because there is a difference, and it matters even when no one else can see it. I picked up my clutch from the table. I was going to walk out of the Fairview Club with my head level, and I was not going to stop to say anything, because anything I said would be heard as begging for something that was never going to be offered freely. And then I heard the second chair. Colin stood up. Not quickly, he had never done anything quickly in the 6 years I had known him, but with the same deliberate stillness that had made me trust him the first time we met. He buttoned his jacket. He picked up his glass. He looked at his mother, and the room, which had been exhaling with relief that I was leaving, went quiet again for a completely different reason. He said, "Before Serena goes, there's something I think this room should hear." Rosalind's composure flickered. Just for a second. She said his name, just his name, in that tone that mothers have perfected across centuries. But he had already begun, and the room had already turned to listen, and there was nothing to do but let him speak. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. The silence in the room did all of that for him. He told them about the Aldrich Foundation. For those in the room who weren't aware, and from the expressions on the faces around me, most weren't, the foundation was my mother-in-law's signature charitable project. She had established it 11 years ago in her late husband's name, a small registered organization that funded affordable housing initiatives in the East End of Toronto. It had her name on the annual gala invitation. It was mentioned in her bio at every function she attended. It was the thing she said when someone asked what she did with her time. 2 years ago, the foundation had nearly lost its charitable registration with the Canada Revenue Agency. I watched Gavin's head come up when Colin said this. The issue had been a multi-year problem with the way program expenditures had been reported relative to the foundation's administrative costs. There are rules under the Income Tax Act, thresholds and ratios that registered charities have to maintain, and over 3 consecutive filing years, the foundation had drifted outside those boundaries in a way that was not intentional but was, in the CRA's view, a pattern. The notice of intent to revoke had arrived on a Thursday morning. Rosalind had called Colin in a panic, and Colin, because he did not know how to navigate a CRA revocation proceeding, had called me. I was a structural engineer, not an accountant, but I knew numbers, and I knew paperwork, and I knew which questions to ask. Over the following 4 months, I had worked with the foundation's bookkeeper, a man I had never met before, who worked out of a small office in Scarborough, to reconstruct 4 years of financial records, reclassify expenditures correctly, draft a remediation plan, and submit a formal response to the CRA before the revocation window closed. I had done it on evenings and weekends. I had taken 1 vacation day to drive to the CRA office in person when a deadline could not wait. I had not told anyone outside of Colin and the bookkeeper because Rosalind had asked me not to. She said it would be embarrassing if word got out. I had agreed to that without hesitation, because I understood what her reputation meant to her, and because 60 families were eventually going to live in the units that foundation funded, and I thought that mattered more than credit. The foundation kept its charitable status. The gala went ahead as planned that spring. I attended and sat at a table near the back. The room at the Fairview Club was very quiet now, not uncomfortable quiet, recalculating quiet. Colin kept going. 18 months ago, the foundation's flagship project, 60 affordable housing units in Leslieville, an initiative Rosalind had championed publicly for 3 years, and which had been featured in a Toronto Life profile she had framed and hung in her hallway, had run into a serious structural problem. The contractor, a company she had chosen because the owner was an old family friend, had poured the foundation slabs incorrectly. The error was in the load distribution across the north face of the building. It was the kind of thing that doesn't surface until a building inspector flags it, and by the time it was flagged, the project was 7 months into construction, and the charitable partners had already announced the completion timeline publicly. I had been the one who caught the full extent of it. I had gone to the site at Rosalind's request. She'd said she just wanted a second opinion, that she wasn't worried but wanted reassurance, and I had come back with a 14-page report that said the slabs needed to be partially broken out and repowered, that the load-bearing walls on the north side had to be redesigned, and that the original contractor, however well-intentioned, did not have the expertise to execute the remediation safely on his own. Rosalind had sat across from me at her dining room table and read the report in silence. Then she had looked up and asked what it would mean for the timeline. I told her we could recover it if we moved quickly. She asked if I could oversee the remediation. I said yes. She asked if I would keep the reason quiet. The original contractor was a family friend, and she didn't want him publicly blamed for something that might have been partly a design miscommunication. I said yes to that too. I spent the next 8 months making site visits, coordinating with a remediation contractor, reviewing revised structural drawings, and signing off on the corrected work. I drove to Leslieville in January when the temperature was -18 and the site was half covered in tarps. I revised reports on our kitchen table at 11 at night while Colin made me tea and didn't ask me why I kept doing it. I built the foundation nothing. Not for my time, not for my travel, not for a single kilometer driven. The units had received their final occupancy permits 3 months ago. There had been a small ceremony covered in a community newsletter. Rosalind's name was in the headline. Mine was not mentioned. I had not expected it to be. Colin said all of this, not quickly, not dramatically, but clearly, the way he always communicated, with the quiet precision of someone who has spent years understanding that the truth does not need to be performed to land. When he finished, a woman at the table to our left, whom I recognized as one of the foundation's long-standing board members, set her glass down very carefully and said, in a voice that was perfectly controlled, that she had not been aware the CRA matter had required outside assistance, and that she had certainly not been informed of any structural issues on the Leslieville project requiring remediation. Rosalind opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Gavin put his hand flat on the table, not gesturing toward anyone, just resting it there, like he needed something solid underneath him. His wife was looking at her lap. 2 other guests leaned toward each other and spoke in low voices. Someone near the window pushed back from the table slightly, creating a small physical distance that hadn't been there before. The room that had been assembled to celebrate my mother-in-law's legacy was very quietly beginning to look at her differently. And she could feel it, and there was nothing she could do about it, because the facts were the facts, and Colin had just spoken them plainly in front of everyone she had ever wanted to impress. Colin reached back and found my hand. I had not noticed I was still standing until he did that. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't look around the room for a reaction. He simply laced his fingers through mine, and we began to walk toward the door. We passed the table where Gavin was sitting. He looked up at me. I don't know what I expected to see in his face, contempt maybe or defensiveness. What I saw instead was something more like exhaustion, like a person who had known, on some level, that this particular evening could not hold the weight being asked of it, and had been waiting quietly for the moment when that became undeniable. I did not stop to talk to him. At the door to the private dining room, I stopped. Not because I had planned to. I hadn't planned anything past the decision not to cry. But because I turned back and I saw my mother-in-law still standing at the head of the table, and I thought of 60 families in Leslieville, who were in warm, structurally sound apartments, this October. And I thought that she should know that I knew that too. I looked at her across the room, clearly enough that anyone nearby would hear, and I said, "The units are safe, every one of them. I made sure of it." Then I turned and walked out. The hallway outside the private dining room was carpeted and quiet, and the sound of the dinner behind us was muffled immediately, like a hand pressed over something. The coat check was at the far end. I could hear my own heels on the tile where the carpet ended. Colin pressed the elevator button, and we stood side by side, and he said, "I'm sorry I didn't warn you." I've been sitting on that for 2 years and he stopped. I couldn't watch her do it again. I told him I wasn't angry, I meant it. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from spending years trying to be enough for someone who has already decided you aren't. It doesn't feel like grief when you're in it. It feels like effort, like strategy. Like if you could just find the right combination of patience and competence and warmth and restraint, something would eventually shift. I had tried that combination in dozens of arrangements over 6 years, in that house in Forest Hill and at galas and at Christmas dinners and at a kitchen table with envelopes, and none of it had worked, and standing in the hallway of the Fairview Club, I finally understood why. It was not a combination problem. It was never going to shift. Some things simply don't take, as she had said. She'd meant it as a dismissal. I was beginning to think she had been accidentally right. The elevator arrived. We stepped in, the doors closed. Outside King Street in October. The cold hit my face immediately, and I felt it in my chest, and I was grateful for it. Grateful for something that was just cold and clean and not complicated by history. Colin put his jacket around my shoulders without asking. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not moving toward the parking garage, just standing in the kind of ordinary city noise that goes on around you, regardless of what you've just been through. He asked if I was all right. I thought about it properly before answering, which is something I've learned to do over the years instead of answering quickly and then correcting myself later. I said that I was, and that I thought I had known on some level that tonight was always going to be a version of this. That there had always been something my mother-in-law needed to say out loud, something she had been holding in careful check for years, and she had finally said it, and now it was said. And there was something almost clarifying about that. Like a window that had been fogged over for as long as I could remember, and someone had finally wiped it clear, and yes, what was on the other side was not what I'd hoped for, but at least it was visible now. At least it was real. Colin told me he had spoken with the foundation's board chair the week before. Not to stage anything, just to make sure that someone who needed to know did know before something worse happened down the line. The board chair had been surprised and had said he would need to ask some questions. I asked Colin why he had never said anything before. All those months when I was driving to Leslieville in the dark and rewriting remediation reports on our kitchen table at 11 at night. He said he'd asked me, back then, whether I wanted him to say something to her, and I had told him not to. I had said it wasn't the right time. I remembered that conversation. I remembered exactly what I had said and why. I had still been hoping, back then, that the right time would eventually arrive. That if I just kept being useful and quiet and present, something would become possible that hadn't been possible before. That she would see me, eventually, the way I wanted to be seen. I said, I think tonight was the right time. He put his arm around me, and we started walking toward the parking garage on Yonge, and the city went about its business the way cities always do. Indifferent and functional and bright. And I thought about 60 families in Leslieville who were in warm apartments this October, because the walls were built correctly, and the permits were signed, and the work had been done right. I thought about that, and I thought it was enough. It was more than enough. It had always been enough, even when no one was watching, and no one was going to say so. I did not cry in the car. I did not feel the need to. What I felt was more like a door closing, not the dramatic slam of an ending, but the quiet click of a latch. The kind of sound that means something has settled properly into place and will stay there. My mother-in-law called the following morning. I let it go to voicemail. She did not leave a message. The board member I had seen at the dinner, the woman who had set her glass down so carefully, sent me an email 3 days later. She thanked me for the work I had done on the foundation's behalf and said she hoped we would speak soon about its future. I replied that I would be glad to. I meant that. Colin and I drove back to Sudbury for Thanksgiving the following week. My mother made a turkey, and my brother brought a case of Canadian, and nobody once asked me to leave any room I was standing in. We played cards after dinner, and my father fell asleep in his chair, and the dog got into something on the counter, and it was ordinary and uncomplicated and exactly what it had always been, the kind of love that doesn't ask you to earn it first. Sitting at that table, with my family around me in the simple and unearned way that families are sometimes just around you, I thought about what Rosalind had said. Not about me specifically, but the idea underneath it. That belonging is something that has to be proven, that love is a test and some people pass it and some people don't, and that the ones who don't can be named as such in a room full of witnesses without consequence. I had spent 6 years living inside that idea, even when I didn't want to, even when I knew better. I didn't anymore. Some things don't take, she had said. She was thinking about me. She had no idea she was describing herself.